My brother stood at the front of the banquet hall, champagne glass in hand, and said, "Let's be honest. Sarah was always the one we worried about. The one who never quite figured out what to do with her life." 200 people laughed. My mother smiled into her napkin. My father raised his glass to toast his successful son and didn't even glance my way. I sat at the back table, in the same gray blazer I'd worn for years, while my brother Mark accepted applause for a promotion at his father-in-law's company, a company I would later learn that was already 3 months from bankruptcy. I didn't say a word. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, but 30 minutes later, a man in a crisp navy uniform walked through those double doors, scanned the room, and stopped cold when his eyes landed on me. He didn't look at Mark. He didn't look at my father. He looked at me, came to a stop 3 feet away, straightened his back, and said one word that made the entire room go silent. "Admiral, and my name is Sarah Whitfield, and for 41 years, my family believed I was the one who never amounted to anything. To understand how we got to that banquet hall, you have to go back to a kitchen table in Ohio, 35 years earlier. I was 6 years old. Mark was 8. We were doing the thing every kid does, showing our parents something we'd made at school. Mark had built a small wooden birdhouse in shop class. I had brought home a spelling test. 100%. Every word right. My father looked at Mark's birdhouse, turned it over in his big hands, and said, "Now that's something. That's real work." Then he glanced at my paper, nodded once, and set it down without a word. I remember staring at that 100% for a long time after he walked away, trying to figure out what was wrong with it. It wasn't a single moment that broke something in me. It was years of single moments, stacked one on top of another, until they became the architecture of our family. When Mark made the junior varsity baseball team, my parents took him to a steak dinner. When I made the honor roll 3 years running, my mother said, "That's nice, sweetheart," while folding laundry, without looking up. When Mark got into a minor car accident at 17, my father spent a weekend helping him fix the bumper, the two of them laughing in the garage. Classic rock on the radio. When I won a statewide science competition that same year, a competition with judges from 3 universities, my father was at Mark's baseball game. My mother came to watch me present, sat in the back row, and left before they announced the winners because she had to get dinner started. I won first place. I told her on the phone that night. She said, "That's great, honey. Did you remember to take the chicken out of the freezer this morning? Mark's coming over for dinner." I was the one who never needed anything. The one who did her homework without being asked, who got good grades without tutoring, who never got in trouble. And somehow that made me invisible. Mark needed help, so Mark got attention. I didn't need help, so I got none. By the time I left for college, I understood the deal. There would be 2 kinds of news in our family, things that happened to Mark which mattered and things that happened to me which were nice. And I want to be clear about something because this isn't a story about hating my brother. Mark wasn't cruel when we were young. He was just a kid who got used to being the center of a universe our parents built around him. He didn't build that universe. They did. He just lived in it, the way you live in a house without ever once wondering who poured the foundation. The cruelty came later. It came with comfort, and with 30 years of being told he was the one who mattered. I joined the Navy at 22. I didn't tell my family beforehand. I told them after I'd already signed the papers, sitting at that same kitchen table, my duffel bag already packed in the car. My father looked at me like I'd told him I was joining a circus. "The Navy," he repeated. "You me," I said. "What are you going to do? Scrub decks?" I remember exactly how that landed. Not like an insult, insults I could handle. It landed like confirmation. Confirmation that in his mind, I had a ceiling, and that ceiling was low, and nothing I did would ever make him look up and notice it. "I'll figure it out," I said. My mother didn't cry. She didn't hug me. She said, "Well, I hope you know what you're doing," in the same tone she used when I told her I was taking the trash out. Mark wasn't even there. He was at a concert with friends, using money my parents had given him for networking, which I later learned meant tickets to see a band he liked. That I drove to the bus station alone. For the next 19 years, my family's understanding of my life stayed almost exactly where it was on that day. To them, I was in the Navy doing something with computers, I think, which is what my mother told her book club when they asked. She wasn't lying to be cruel. She genuinely didn't know. She never asked the kind of questions that would have given her an answer. Meanwhile, Mark's life was a running commentary at every family gathering. Mark got a promotion. Mark bought a house. Mark and his wife were thinking about a bigger house. Mark's father-in-law was bringing him into the business. Every holiday dinner became, in some way, a progress report on Mark. Nobody ever asked me what a yeoman did or what a department head was, or why I kept moving to new cities every few years. When I made lieutenant commander, I mentioned it once, briefly, over the phone. My mother said, "Oh, that's nice. Did you hear Mark's getting a corner office?" I stopped mentioning things after that. Not out of bitterness. Out of efficiency. Why hand someone information they have no interest in holding? What my family didn't know, what nobody outside a very small circle knew, was what I was actually doing. I'd found something in the Navy that I'd never had at home, a place where the work spoke for itself, where nobody cared whose kid you were, only whether you could do the job and do it under pressure, and do it again the next day when you were exhausted and scared, and it mattered anyway that I excelled. Not because I was trying to prove anything to my family by then. I genuinely didn't think about them most days, but because for the first time, effort and recognition were connected to each other. I put in the work, and the work was seen. Over the next 2 decades, I moved through assignments that I couldn't fully discuss, even if anyone had asked. Surface warfare. Staff positions. A tour that involved more time underwater than I'm allowed to talk about, on a boat that doesn't show up on tourist maps. I earned my commission, then earned the trust of people who don't extend trust easily. That be why the time I was 40, I commanded a destroyer squadron. By 43, I was wearing the star of a rear admiral. My family found out I'd been promoted to admiral the same way they found out most things about my life. They didn't. I came home for my father's 70th birthday in my civilian clothes, jeans, a sweater, the same kind of low-key outfit I always wore around them, and nobody asked a single question about my work. Mark spent 20 minutes describing a deal he'd closed. My father beamed the entire time that I sat there in a room full of people who loved Mark out loud and loved me. I assumed, somewhere quiet and unspoken, the way you might love a piece of furniture you'd had for years, and stopped noticing that I want to be honest with you. It didn't hurt the way it used to. By that point, I'd built a life so full of career, a team of sailors I respected and who respected me, friendships forged in places where your life genuinely depended on the person next to you, that my family's blind spot had become more like background noise. Sad sometimes, but no longer something that could knock me down, which is why, when the invitation to Mark's promotion celebration arrived 8 months ago, I almost didn't go. The invitation was elaborate. Embossed cardstock. A banquet hall downtown. Celebrating Mark Whitfield's appointment as senior vice president. My mother called to make sure I was coming. "It's a big deal, Sarah," she said. "Mark worked so hard for this. I'll be there," I told her. I almost didn't say what I said next. But something in me, maybe 40 years of something in me, made me add, "I'm actually retiring soon myself." 30 years in the Navy. There was a pause on the line. "Oh," my mother said. "That's nice, honey. Will you need a ride from the airport?" I told her I'd rent a car. I flew in on a Friday, checked into a hotel near the venue, and spent Saturday morning walking around the city in civilian clothes, in no hurry to get to a party where I already knew my role. Quiet sister in the back, nodding along while someone else's life got celebrated. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the man hosting the event that night wasn't just Mark's father-in-law. He was someone I'd worked with 11 years earlier, during the worst 48 hours of my career. A civilian engineer who'd been on my ship during a classified joint exercise that went wrong in ways that never made the news. A man whose life and the lives of 6 others I'd helped pull out of a flooding compartment with 11 minutes of air left between all of us. A man named Richard Calloway. Mark's new boss. The banquet hall was the kind of place that smelled like flowers and money. Crystal chandeliers. A jazz quartet in the corner. Round tables covered in white linen, each one set for 10. I arrived a few minutes late, on purpose, and found my seat at table 12, the table farthest from the stage, next to my parents and across from an empty chair that I assumed was for Mark's wife's cousin, who texted that he might be running late. My father gave me a brief nod. My mother air-kissed my cheek and immediately turned to compliment the woman next to her on her dress. I sat down, smoothed my napkin into my lap, and looked toward the front of the room, where Mark stood beside a podium, glowing in a way I recognized from 30 years of family events, the particular glow of a person who has never once doubted that the room belongs to him. The lights dimmed. A man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, took the podium and began to speak about exciting new leadership and fresh energy and exactly the kind of family-oriented values we want at the top of this company. I would learn later that this man was the company's outgoing CFO, and that exciting new leadership was a phrase he'd been told to say by someone above him, someone who hadn't yet walked into the room. Then Mark took the microphone. He thanked his wife. He thanked his father-in-law, wherever he is right now, probably stuck in traffic. Am I right? Laughter. He thanked everyone who believed in me, and then his eyes found me, 3 tables back, and something in his face shifted into the particular expression I'd been on the receiving end of my entire life, the warm, public, slightly pitying smile that always preceded a joke at my expense. I do want to give a shout-out to my sister Sarah, he said, gesturing toward me with his glass. The room's attention drifted toward our table. Sarah's been to, what would you call it? Sarah figuring things out for a while now. A ripple of polite laughter. And oh, but seriously, Mark continued, clearly enjoying himself now. Growing up, everyone always said Sarah was the smart one. Valedictorian potential, all that. And then she joined the military instead of, doing something with it. He shrugged, grinning. Did I guess we can't all end up running departments, right? The laughter was bigger this time. Someone at a nearby table actually clapped, and I felt my mother shift slightly beside me, not toward me, but away. The way you might lean away from something you didn't want to be associated with, and my father didn't react at all. He raised his glass toward Mark and called out, "That's my boy." I sat very still. Did I want to tell you that in that moment I felt rage, or humiliation, or the urge to stand up and announce exactly who I was and exactly what I'd done with my life? But honestly, what I felt was something quieter and stranger, a kind of tired familiarity. Like watching a rerun of a show you'd seen 100 times. Knowing every line before it was said, I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The applause for Mark's speech was still settling when the double doors at the back of the hall opened. A man walked in. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him that morning. He moved through the room with a kind of easy authority that makes people unconsciously step aside, even when they don't know who he is. I recognized him immediately. Richard Calloway. He hadn't aged the way I expected. He looked healthier, actually tanned, solid, nothing like the gray, terrified engineer I dragged through a flooded compartment with my own hands 11 years ago, his arm broken in 2 places, water rising past our knees while I screamed at him to keep moving, don't stop moving. He scanned the room the way people in charge always do, quickly, efficiently, cataloging faces. And then his eyes reached table 12. And stopped. He went still in a way that drew attention even from people who had no idea who he was. The outgoing CFO at the podium trailed off mid-sentence. Mark, still holding the microphone, turned to follow Calloway's gaze, clearly confused about what or who had captured the new owner's attention so completely. Richard Calloway crossed the room. He walked past the podium. Past Mark. Past my parents. He stopped 3 feet from my chair, and for a moment, he just looked at me, like he was making sure his eyes weren't playing a trick on him. Then he straightened, not metaphorically, but literally, his shoulders pulling back, his chin lifting, the posture of a man falling into an old habit he'd never quite lost, and he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room, "Admiral." For a moment, nobody moved. I think the room genuinely didn't understand what they'd just heard. Admiral isn't a word people expect to hear directed at a woman in a plain navy dress, sitting quietly at the back table of someone else's party. Mark let out an awkward laugh into the microphone. "I think you've got the wrong table, Richard," he said, trying to recover the room. "That's just my sister." Richard Calloway didn't look at Mark. He didn't look away from me at all. "Rear Admiral Sarah Whitfield," he said, his voice steady but rough at the edges. The way a voice gets when someone is fighting to keep it level. United States Navy. He extended his hand toward me, and when I took it, he didn't shake it so much as hold it, the way you hold the hand of someone you thought you might never see again. "You don't remember me," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I remember you," Richard the First said quietly. "Compartment 4. USS Mitchell. 11 years ago." His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "You pulled me out," he said. "You and 2 of your guys. I had a broken arm. I couldn't swim. The water was..." He stopped, swallowed, and turned to face the room, raising his voice so everyone could hear. This woman crawled back into a flooding compartment 3 times to get the rest of my team out. I was the last one. I thought I was done. I had already made peace with it. He looked back at me. You told me, "Not on my ship, Richard. Not today." And then you got me out. The room was completely silent now. 200 people who, 30 seconds earlier, had been laughing at a joke about a woman who couldn't figure out what to do with her life, now sat frozen, staring at the back table. "I bought this company 8 months ago," Calloway continued, still addressing the room, though I think by now he was really speaking to my family. "I've spent 30 years in engineering and operations, working with the military more times than I can count. And in all that time, there are maybe 3 people I've met who I'd trust with my life without a second thought." He looked at me again. "She's one of them." He turned, finally, toward Mark, who was still standing at the podium, microphone slack in his hand, his face the color of the white tablecloths. "Mark," Calloway said, his tone shifting into something businesslike, almost gentle, the way you might speak to someone you were about to disappoint. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about who's been sitting at the back of this room all night. I want to pause here because what happened next is something I've thought about a lot, since it would have been easy, natural, even after 30 years for me to stand up in that moment and let it all out. To look at my brother, in front of 200 people, and say everything I'd swallowed since I was 6 years old at a kitchen table with a perfect spelling test nobody wanted to see it. I didn't. I stood up. Yes. But I didn't go to the podium. I didn't ask for the microphone. I walked over to Richard, and I put my hand on his arm, and I said, quietly, just for him, "It's good to see you again, Richard. I'm glad you're okay." Then I turned to the room, to 200 strangers, to my parents, to my brother standing frozen at the podium, and I said, "I think the celebration should keep going. This is Mark's night." And I sat back down. I have never seen a room more confused in my life. The party didn't really recover, not in the way Mark's promotion had been intended to be celebrated. People clustered in small groups, whispering. The jazz quartet kept playing, but nobody was really listening anymore. Every few minutes, someone would glance toward our table, then look away quickly when they caught me noticing. My mother sat beside me, completely silent, for almost 10 minutes. Then she said, very quietly, not looking at me, "An admiral." "Yes," I said. "How long?" "Almost 4 years. She was quiet again. "Then you never told us that I told you I was retiring soon." I said. "You asked if I needed a ride from the airport." My mother didn't respond to that. She just looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and I watched something move across her face that I'd genuinely never seen there before, not toward me, anyway. It took me a moment to place it with shame. My father didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. Not out of anger, I don't think. I think he genuinely didn't know what to say, and rather than risk saying the wrong thing, he said nothing at all. The way he'd done my entire childhood. Whenever I did something that didn't fit the story, he'd already decided to tell about his children. Mark found me near the coat check as the party was winding down. He looked smaller than he had at the podium, not physically, but in some other way, like the air had gone out of something. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was something closer to bewildered. "You never asked," I said. And I meant it gently. I wasn't trying to wound him with it. It was just the truth, the simplest version of 30 years. "All those years," he said slowly. I thought he stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "I made that joke tonight because I thought it was true. I actually thought it was true. That you were just stopped behind. That you needed help, and nobody wanted to embarrass you by bringing it up." "Did I know?" I said. "Richard told me," Mark said. "After you left the table, he told me what you did. On that ship. He said you went back in 3 times. He said," Mark's voice caught. "He said he has a framed photo of his daughter's wedding in his office, and you're in it. Because you're the reason he was alive to walk her down the aisle." I didn't say anything. "I made fun of you," Mark said, "in front of 200 people, for not figuring out your life." "You did," I agreed. He looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my brother looked at me the way you look at someone you're meeting for the first time, really looking, the way you do when all your old assumptions have just been pulled out from under you, and you're standing there with nothing to replace them. "Yet I'm sorry," he said. I don't even know what else to say. "I'm sorry." "Did I know?" I said again. And then, because it was true, and because I didn't need anything else from him, "It's okay." Mark, he didn't look like he believed that it was okay. I think, in some ways, it was the first time in his life he'd had to sit with the idea that he might have gotten something fundamentally wrong, not about a deal, or a decision, but about a person. About his own sister. I didn't stay much longer after that. I said goodnight to my parents. My mother held onto my hand for a moment longer than usual and said, "I'd like to hear about it sometime, if you'd want to tell me," and I walked out into the cool evening air alone. The way I'd walked into most rooms in my life. Here's what I didn't say to Mark, or to my parents, or to anyone in that banquet hall. I didn't need that moment, and I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. Of course it felt good, in some small human way, to have the truth finally visible in a room that had spent so long looking past me. I'm not going to pretend that didn't register at all, but by the time Richard Calloway said my name in that ballroom, I had already lived an entire life that meant something to the sailors I'd led, to the people I'd worked beside, to Richard and 6 others who got to go home to their families because of choices I made in 11 minutes I still think about sometimes, late at night. That life was real before anyone in that room knew about it. It would have been just as real if Richard Calloway had never walked through those doors. My worth was never something that needed my family's signature to become valid. It had been valid the entire time, through every spelling test nobody looked at, through every holiday dinner where my name didn't come up, through 19 years of doing something with computers, I think. What changed that night wasn't who I was. What changed was that, for the first time, my family could see it. I retired from the Navy 4 months later, in a ceremony attended by people who had served with me, fought beside me, and trusted me with their lives. My parents came. So did Mark and his wife. And this part still surprises me a little. Richard Calloway, who flew in on short notice and sat in the front row next to my mother. Afterward, my father shook my hand. He's never been a man of many words, and I didn't expect a speech. But he held onto my hand a beat longer than he needed to, and he said, "I should have asked more questions." It wasn't an apology, exactly. But coming from him, it was close enough. Did I think about that banquet hall, sometimes the silence after Richard said my name, the way 200 strangers suddenly saw someone who had been sitting among them the whole time, unnoticed, and I think about all the people watching this who might be sitting in their own version of that back table right now. Overlooked. Underestimated. Quietly doing the work while someone else gets the toast, the applause, the corner office. I want you to know something, and I mean this with my whole heart. Your worth was never waiting on someone else's recognition to become real. Some people spend their whole lives hoping someone will finally walk through the door and say their name out loud, in front of everyone, so the world will finally know what they've always known about themselves. But the truth is simpler, and maybe harder to hold on to. You already know. And that has always been enough.